I'm Michelle Adams. I'm also one of the school social workers at the board.
And my name is Nicole McSweeney, a fellow social worker as well.
Awesome. So here's where we're at today. We're just recognizing, that there's been a lot of grief and loss over these past few months. And although we're speaking about grief in relation specific to death, we recognize that there's also a lot of other losses that may need to be grieved, right? Loss of jobs, loss of connections, loss of normalcy. It isn't just death. And typically with grief, there's a lot of turn taking, right? Usually not everything happens at the same time. But in this time, there really is a collective grief that we're all in it together, and at times it can make everything feel really heavy, right? And it's harder also because all the rituals we used to have, we might not be able to do anymore, right? From eliminating the number of people at funerals to not having people over to support us. And it's hard, right? For kids who don't have all their normal routines or distractions that they would typically do. It's hard, and it's hard for all of us, especially when we feel alone in our grief. And so we're hoping that this structure over the next hour, this workshop over the next hour, will give us some structure in terms of trying to support our kids and give us some ways to process grief. And so whether you're a parent, a caregiver, or a trusted adult, or you're just going through something right now, or you just want to know in general how to support children, we hope this will be helpful for you because we all go through it eventually. And as well, because of the heaviness of this topic, this may bring up some thoughts and emotions for you. And if you need to take a breather or a break and come back to this a little bit later, do what makes sense for you. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes with some time for question and answer at the end for about 15 minutes. And we may ask you at times to use the chat box. Just be mindful of what you post. And if you have a question during, put it in the chat box, and we don't answer it as part of our presentation. We'll try to do so at the end. A couple of housekeeping items. Please note that this is being recorded. And as well, if you notice at the top through Otter Air Live, there's also a way for you to see what's being said written down. Okay, so we'll just kind of get started. And so why are we supporting grief, right? Because for all of us and children who are grieving, we need to feel that the loss is acknowledged, that it's not too terrible to talk about, that we can actually have others sit with us in our pain, and that the loved person will not be forgotten. Right? It's not necessarily about making someone feel better or less distressed, although that can happen with some support and processing those feelings of grief. But it's giving that person a place and a space to explore their feelings and emotions and to talk about the person who has died or the loss they're experiencing. Right? And we're there to listen, to bear witness, and to make space for that. And it's, again, not just death, right? That there's job loss, health concerns, being isolated, life events, sense of safety and security, and all these different kind of losses that can happen and that have been happening due to COVID-19. But what is grief? So we're just going to start right here with a very simple definition of what grief is. Right? It's our natural response to loss. Right? It's all those feelings and emotions you have when someone close to you has died. And it's not easy to talk about that. Right? And we often try to avoid it because it is uncomfortable. It's such a taboo topic, right? It's a reflection of our connection to that person, right? So here's what I'd like you to do in our chat box. I'm curious, what are some of the different sayings you've heard when talking to people about death? What are some of the euphemisms you've often heard? And I'm curious how many we can come up with. So if you can go to your chat box, and we'll see if we can get some responses, and I'll kind of throw some out there to see if you've heard of these before. Okay. Right. So here are a few that I've heard, and you can definitely throw down your suggestions as you. There we go. I think I see one. Sorry for your loss. Yep. All right. Maybe you've heard of this one. Passed on. They found out. Oh, thank you. There's a better place. They're asleep. Lost. They bit the dust or bite the dust. Bought the farm. Final resting place. Right? We have all these sayings to kind of avoid how uncomfortable it often is. Right? Thank you for those who threw some ideas out there. Right? Because we don't really do anyone any favors when we avoid the topic, because there's so many real thoughts and emotions we have. Right? And it's important when we talk with kids that we use kind of very clear and simple language. right? We use the words death and dying, especially for kids, because it can get kind of confusing. Can you imagine some of the questions they may have? Well, if they're asleep, well, when are they going to wake up? Right? If they pass on, where did they pass on to? What kind of better place did they go to? I want to go there. Did they just get lost? Will I get lost? Right? And so it's important to be as honest as possible, right? To maintain that trust with our kids and to use direct and simple language, right? So something like this, right? Well, death is when the body stops working and it can't start again. And so when we think of grief, right, we may experience a range of emotions like sadness, anger, fear, confusion, guilt. And we used to think, well, it's kind of linear like this, right? You go through these nice stages, right? You start from loss and eventually you learn how to adjust, right? But if you've ever gone through a loss, it actually feels a lot more like this. It's all over the place, right? We may experience emotions one at a time. We may experience them several at a time. Sometimes we're doing great, other times not so much. Sometimes we're really sad and angry, and sometimes we're okay, right? And just because we found a new normal, right? That's kind of the term these days, or we've adjusted, it doesn't mean we don't experience those emotions again, right? Because sometimes a new loss or death may trigger feelings from a previous loss, and that's normal. That's okay. And important to remember that everyone deals with grief differently. There's no one way to grieve or no one right way to grieve, right? And especially for kids, it changes over the years, right? As they develop, it may mean something on later on, right? And this will often happen. That a parent may die when the child is quite young, right? And then in high school, all of a sudden it hits them. Oh, my parent isn't going to be there to help me drive or see me at graduation, right? Because they've changed, and the grief and the loss means something different, right? And that sometimes it's also important to normalize that the grieving person may have some feelings of comfort or happiness when they're recalling a special memory, right? And they need to know that that's okay as well. That sometimes it's all over the place, and all these different emotions are okay. And this is what it might look like, right? And this is from their school mental health Ontario. This might look like for adults as well, right? That grief doesn't just look like crying or sadness. For younger kids, it could mean changing moods or emotions. It might mean a little bit of little motivation or interest in schoolwork activities, difficulty concentrating, or increased need for contact and reassurance. For older students, it may mean withdrawal from family activities, questioning fairness, worried about safety of family and friends and self, wanting to be with friends more. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, right? And if you go to like our little iceberg at the back there, right? That this is what the top looks like, right? These are all the behaviors that you might see. And on the bottom though, they're really grieving. And it's just kind of asking those questions and being able to connect more with all that stuff underneath. Well, what are they really thinking and feeling? Nicole, I think you're up.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. So this quote for me by Julie Stokes has really helped illuminate for me maybe a little bit of the differences that you might see between grieving adults and grieving children. So for adults, grief is like wading through this enormous river, whereas for children, it's puddle jumping, but when they're in that puddle, it's no different to the river. And so that's kind of the idea of emotions coming in waves, and sometimes they're referred to as grief bursts. And that seems particularly relevant to the way kids grieve. So they could be distracted, they could be doing okay, and then something hits them. But when they're in that puddle, it's as deep for them as the river is for adults. So it's just helpful to keep that in the back of your mind when you're supporting kids through a grief process. And then here are some myths, and maybe you've heard of some different myths about how children grieve. We saw the one earlier that Jeremy showed where grief is a very nice, linear, sort of packaged, staged phenomenon, when really it's really all over the place. And here are some myths that you may have heard or may have thought of in the past. So children are too young to grieve or understand what death is. So actually kids as young as 2 or 3 can understand the concept of death, particularly if it's explained very simply and in sort of language that kids of that age can understand. And kids understand emotions. They might not always be able to label them or identify them, but they do feel them. So you can always make a connection between, by helping kids identify sort of what they're feeling. Sometimes feel like if kids aren't crying, it means they're not sad or they're not responding in an appropriate way. Um, but tears are not the only indicator, as Jeremy showed you in the previous slide, of grief. And I've had lots of kids tell me that their tears are on the inside and other people can't see them. Where are we? Children aren't affected by adults' grief. Well, actually, adults model lots of different kinds of behaviors and responses for kids. So children are often watching us closely to see how we're reacting and responding to different situations. So if you're able to model grief and give permission to feel, kids will follow along. If children aren't talking about it, neither should we. Or if I start talking about it, children will think about it all the time. Well, the fact is that children do think about it, whether we talk about it or not. So us bringing it up isn't going to make them think about it more or make it harder for them. In fact, it opens up an opportunity for them to try and process some of the confusing feelings that they might be experiencing. And it is better to say nothing than the wrong thing. And I think this is where a lot of people really get hung up, because we so badly want to make things better and make people feel better. And the reality is there's very little you can say that's going to take away the pain. So it's really about providing the opportunity to process the experience and the emotions that they're going through. And then there's one myth not on here that I just wanted to add. Often when kids are very, very young, infants, or sometimes even when there's a significant death in the family before a child is born, people often think that that child won't be maybe as impacted as other people in the family if they didn't really have a long relationship with that person or even know that person. But what they find is that when that particular child gets older, they realize that they don't have any of their own memories or own special times that they can remember with that individual. And that is what their loss is. Any memories they have are memories that are really other people's memories. So they can be impacted just as much as other people, even if they're very, very young at the time of the death. And then this slide is from Andrea Warnick, who is kind of like a guru in children's grief and death and dying. And this is what she's found, that often, she calls them the 4 C's, what kids are often thinking when they're told about a death in their family. Did I cause it? Can I cure it? Can I catch it? And who is going to take care of me? And often, I mean, some adults have some of these questions as well. If I had just done this differently, or if, you know, there's all sorts of things where you think if I had done something differently, or if could I have prevented what happened? Interestingly, in the time of COVID, usually the can I cure it and can I catch it, if it's a death from a different kind of illness, you can reassure kids that, in fact, that you didn't cause it and that you didn't catch it. But now with COVID, that is kind of tricky because it is so contagious. And I think that is why so many students and families have opted for virtual schooling this year, is because they don't want to catch it themselves and or be responsible for passing it on to other family members. So this is often sort of what's underpinning what kids are thinking when they learn about a death, particularly if it's a death related to illness. And then who is going to take care of me? That's a big one, particularly if it's a parent that's died or a significant caregiver in the child's life. They wonder a lot about what will happen to them, or if their other parent is more vulnerable and they die as well, that they'll be on their own. That often takes up a lot of children's thoughts if it's a parental death. I have a little example of sort of a script that addresses these questions. This was actually used in a classroom where a teacher had died, but it could easily be used as is or adapted if you're speaking with a child for a death in your more immediate family. So she died last week of heart failure. This means that her heart stopped working. So there you're using the word death or dying, and you're explaining clearly what happened and what it means. What does heart failure mean? It means the heart stops working. It was very sudden and so unexpected. It's hard for me to believe that it's true, but it is. So you're sort of acknowledging the shock of it all, and also modeling for your child that it is really hard to believe, but it happened and we need to deal with it. We don't know why this happened. It wasn't anything specific that caused it. It's not something that is contagious or that you can catch. And so very sadly, it was not something that the doctors could cure or fix. So you're kind of already answering some of these questions that kids might have. And then how do I stay connected to that person? That's really a big one. How do you maintain a connection to the person that you were very close to? And Michelle is going to be talking about that one in more detail a little bit further in the presentation. When children are not given accurate information, they will create information to complete the story. So kids have pretty vivid imaginations, and if there seems to be holes in a story, they will fill it in with whatever they can come up with or whatever is in their realm of reference. And often they will think worst case scenario. So that's another reason why it's really important to give clear and detailed information when you're describing a death to someone. For an example that Jeremy had was working with a youth whose parent was in the ICU, and they went to visit them without a lot of information and noticed a sign on the outside of the door that said that the person in that room would only be there for a week. So it could have been that they were just being transferred to another ward, but the child, who didn't have a lot of information, automatically assumed it meant that their parent was going to die within a week. So that's sort of an example of why just giving some basic information can be really helpful for kids. And how do we do that? How do we start sharing this kind of information? Well, it's really just about talking with our kids and having conversations. So if it's an anticipated death of a parent who's ill, having these conversations kind of before it happens, or right after a death, when a death happens. So yes, so acknowledging the death and providing up-to-date information. Here's a little bit of a starter sentence, if helpful. A difficult thing happened that I want to talk about, or I need to tell you about something that's really upsetting. And it's really important when we talk about modeling grief that you acknowledge that you might be grieving yourself as well. That this is really hard, that you might cry while you're talking about it, because that's how you express sadness. It's important if a child sees you as a parent showing no emotion and never needing help and never needing to talk about it, or seeming to not need to talk about it, they might feel that that's how they have to cope, that they're also not permitted to talk about it. And then they'll be struggling on their own rather than having the support that you could provide them, by just acknowledging and validating that this is really hard and that there's going to be some really hard feelings and tough periods of time. Always important to invite questions, and even starting with, what do you already know? Children often know more and pick up more than we often realize. So asking what they know, it also is an opportunity to clarify or clear up any misconceptions they might have. And clarifying exactly what they're asking. If a child asks what's going to happen next, you might be thinking about long term. Does this impact where you're going to live, or are there going to be other big changes in the family? They might be wanting to know literally what's happening next, like what's happening in the next hour, or what's going to happen to the body. So clarifying what information the children are seeking can be helpful in these conversations. And it's also good to know that you don't have to have all the answers. It's okay to say, I don't know. It's wonderful to wonder with them. That's such an interesting question. I wondered that sometimes myself. You don't have to have all the answers for them. And you can also have do-overs. So you might have a conversation and you don't feel like it's gone very well, or I mean, there can be lots of reasons why it didn't. You can always sit them down and say, remember when we first had this conversation about X? I wasn't sure what to say at the time, and I want to start over. I want to have this conversation again. Um, it's okay to do that. And in fact, it's really healthy to have those kinds of do-overs. Okay. And then, thanks, Jeremy. Including kids. So helping kids to feel included and making them part of the process, whether it's before a death has happened or after a death, prior to a funeral, or even after that, returning to school. It does give kids back some sense of control in what likely feels to them to be a very uncontrollable situation. So if there's an ill significant family member, how do they want to be informed? Do they want to be called in the middle of the school day? Do they want someone to come to the school in person? Do they want to wait till they come home from school? If it's an anticipated death, do they actually want to be present at the time of death? So giving them those options and letting them know whatever they decide is okay can be very helpful. I find often preparing kids for the funeral or memorial service or celebration of life or whatever, there's so many different rituals and customs that we have in our society, helping them to know what to expect, anticipate what they're going to see, letting them know if, for example, it's going to be an open casket, letting them know if the person's been cremated. It's very different, and sometimes kids need to be prepared for what they're going to see, letting them know that there might be lots of people very upset, lots of people crying. Particularly with younger children, I think it's always helpful if they have a designated adult that can be with them, if they need to leave the room and spend some time outside, that they have someone that's kind of their person that they know they can go to during the service. With younger kids, bringing soft toys or coloring activities to keep them occupied. And then for returning to school, do they want their classmates to know what happened? Do they want to be there when that discussion happens? Would they prefer not to be there when that discussion happens? These are all decisions that can be made with kids. And Michelle will talk about it a little later, but that's a particular area that school social work can really be helpful around navigating those kinds of conversations. And then things that get in the way. So there are lots of things that get in the way. These are really, really, really hard and difficult conversations to have. And there's so much that can get in the way, but here's just some things to be mindful of. So the fix it trap, you so badly want to make things better. You want to make children feel better. You want to try and fix it if you can. The problem in these situations is that there is no quick fix to making the pain go away. So this is helpful when it's important to remember to understand that the main purpose of supporting children through grief is listening to them, giving an opportunity for them to talk about how they're feeling, letting them know that they can talk about it and that you're not going to go away, that you're going to be there and help them get through it. So it's just kind of a bit of a mind shift. And then the second thing that can get in the way is minimizing or comparing. So loss is very subjective, and kids and adults need permission to grieve what they perceive as a loss. So careful with, statements like, don't be silly, it was just a goldfish. So to you, it might just be a goldfish, but to that child, perhaps it was the first living being that they were responsible for, that they cared for. Or comments like, I don't know why you're so upset, you really didn't know them that well. And or comparing, like, I know exactly how you feel. It's really hard because it's so individualized that you really can't possibly know exactly how somebody else feels. So more general concepts like, this must be so hard, are often a bit easier. Advising or giving solutions. So have you tried this? Have you tried that? It's not a riddle to be solved, and it can make people feel quite defensive and inadequate if, you know, they should be, it's like they should be over this, and why aren't they? It makes them very, very much question sort of where they are in the process. And then praising, you know, comments like, you're so strong, I would be such a mess, I don't know how you're holding it together. It's meant well, but I think it sometimes creates a pressure for people that you have to be okay, and that you can express emotion, that you have to be able to hold it together. So it takes away that permission to grieve. And then reassuring, give it time, time heals all wounds. Um, and again, the message is meant well. There's a positive intent there. But what if for that person, they don't feel better after a little bit of time, or, you know, an appropriate amount of time has passed? Often in the second year, it can be just as hard or harder for people because they thought that they would be feeling better by then and they're not. And they wonder if something's wrong. So I say all of this, but I want you to know that, you know, even the three of us as professionals, people who've had specific training in supporting grief in children, we have all made these mistakes before. We have all said things we wish we hadn't said. So it's not perfect. These are just really things to sort of be mindful of when you're supporting kids in grieving. And I think now I'm handing it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Nicole. So the last section really talks about how we are creating safe places to grieve, safe places in your homes and relationships, and then in your school community. And it starts with, and Nicole and Jeremy have talked about this, really just listening. And it is very intentional. It is listening without judgment or criticism. And you really want to bear witness to their experience. And their feelings just need to be acknowledged. And that's really the key here. Grief can't be fixed. It's not a problem. It's something that people have to go through and experience. So when we say listen, I'm sure we can all think about those people that we know in our lives that have really listened to us. And I'd like you to just take a moment and just reflect, if you can, what that experience was like for you when you were going through something or you were sharing something and the other person was really listening to you. What kinds of experience did you have? What was that like for you? And that's really what we want to transpire onto our support for children. So often, sort of listening and really kind of being empathetic can be confused with offering sympathy, and those are different. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is going to be a short clip for to demonstrate this. And this is done by Brene Brown, who really is fantastic. And she's a researcher. She talks an awful lot about shame and vulnerability. And she has some workbooks that you can kind of research and see if that applies to your situation. But this video is really, really well, it illustrates really well how sympathy and empathy are different. So as you're listening to this, think about, you know, what you think about the difference between sympathy and empathy, and also what that experience is like for you. So if you can, we would invite you to use the chat, but you don't have to if you're not comfortable with that. But just kind of be aware of the difference there and what that kind of brings out for you if you were to kind of think about a child in mind. Thanks. So so the idea from that is really kind of sitting with the child, with their feelings. And it's extremely difficult as a parent because we instinctively want to help them move past that. But however they're feeling is kind of where they need to be. And when you are connected with them, it immediately helps them. So Anything from that video before we talk about the next section that people that brought up for people? Okay. So towards the end, sorry, at the end, we're going to have some time for people to share some of their questions in a broad way. We can kind of go over that. But the next section is really, how do we stay connected to the deceased person, our loved one? So the the first thing is when someone close to us dies, it doesn't mean that we lose our connection to that person at all. It's important to think about ways that you can maintain that connection. So, firstly, paying attention to important dates like birthdays or holidays or significant dates for the child. Like, for example, if they have a graduation or entering their teen years or being able to drive or something like that, that may be important, that they may need some other way that they can sort of think about how they're connected to that person. What's important for them may be surprising to you as their parent. Setting aside time, checking in regularly. It's not like you have this one conversation or you have conversations heavily around the death and then you kind of don't check in over time. So things change, and it's important to kind of monitor as time goes on. Of course, there's rituals, there's, the person's favorite food, favorite places, activities, those kinds of things to kind of bring that out and be mindful of that. And this in this area, children can be very active. They really can be involved in offering ideas about ways to be creative and do art or music or writing a letter or a scrapbook or sort of a memory box, those kinds of things. Children really do like that part of it, or some children really do like that part of things as a way of keeping things connected to the person. So there's some ways that you can kind of begin this with them, right? Is say I miss or I remember, and these are just some things to try to start conversations, and you can come up with your own. You could pull these out maybe at different points, like birthdays or holidays or those kinds of things. When it's really just an acknowledgement and not being afraid of speaking about the person, but rather creating the space in a safe way so that the child can open up. Um, and towards the end of the workshop, you can think about that. If there's other ways that you can start, you can share those. So now, we've been talking about ways to cope and ways to support children. These are additional ways that we have found could be helpful, is really just naming it. So identify these feelings as grief, and it is okay to feel. Um, as we grieve, we can begin to understand the underlying emotions it brings and address them. Emotions are not right or wrong. However, we need to recognize that we'll experience feelings like denial or anger, frustration, and that sometimes, we do need to really feel those in order to kind of move through grief. Responses to loss and how people experience and express grief vary greatly by individual and individuals in a family. That's not surprising, but it's important to remember grief is a process that we work through, not an event. It's not in a race. Um, and with supportive people around, people move through this. Of course, validate. You might have heard this at different workshops today, but this is really very, very key for children. We need to recognize that all feelings and acknowledge them, acknowledge those feelings without judgment. Kind of suppressing feelings, as Nicole talked about, or feeling guilty for having them, doesn't allow us to take the steps to really fully acknowledge them and resolve them. So we want to encourage ourselves and those around us to mourn and mourn all losses, big or small. We know that routine helps people. So at a time when life feels particularly chaotic, setting the routine is important and ensures that we have a mixture of the social and the physical and educational activities in our day. And it doesn't mean kind of being rigid. We must do this, or this was the way we did it before, so we must do it now this way. But when you have a routine, it can help with a sense of control at a time when there's lots of changes. And self-care. So, time constraints are of course still exist for us. There's virtual work and child and elder care, and socializing can be very, very hectic. So really ensure that there is still time for your own self-care in whatever way that looks. We know physical exercise, meditation, relaxation, those are all ways that we can kind of be kind to ourselves. And also, the script that you have in your head, the shoulds, or I should have done that, or I didn't do that, or those kinds of things. So just be mindful of the way that you speak to yourself. We want to lean on friends and family, during this time, and encouraging the students to socialize virtually is really important. um, People can have Zoom fatigue and all of that, but maybe a phone call is what's needed, or a human connection that can help them with just kind of taking a break from that, and do something different, like preparing a meal, or doing some yard work, or some support in the neighborhood. um, and then there are times where it is important to seek, or it could be helpful to seek. It, now more than ever, it's time to seek the support of professionals if you find that the grief is really interfering in your functioning. So the Canadian Mental Health Association is very, very helpful in this regard. We want to look at, when grief is interfering in functioning, whereas, for children, you might see it's very typical that their sleep is disrupted. But over time, if you're finding that over time, it's difficult for you to manage, the sleep is affected, the appetites are the big things that kind of keep our bodies and our minds going. Communication is really reduced. So there's very little sort of like sharing or talking, that kind of thing, as well as if the emotions get so dysregulated that they feel so big that it's hard to sort of manage and kind of move through a day and function, then those are some of the things, kind of red flags that you might want to seek more support. So the the schools, have a system for this. The professional support staff are available for resources and to support you directly. Certainly, your administrator, often the child's teacher. But social work, this really does fall in our portfolio. We help families, and liaise with the school around the death of a loved one. We are often in the class, talking to the class, when a child is absent because a parent or a loved one has died. We spend time speaking with principals and teachers to support them around grief. And then, definitely providing counseling and support for the student. And sometimes it's for the student, or it's for other family members in the family. So a parent or a caregiver that really needs some support for them in that moment. We know the resources, and then we're very much able to kind of give you those, to provide you a way of kind of giving you someone in the community that could be a helpful resource. And and there are a lot of agencies that can do that, but most specifically are, Dr. J's Children's Grief Center, the Bereaved Families of Ontario, and then Andrea Warnick, who has provided a lot of the content for what we have talked about today. Um, and those are places that, in the community can support you. And also, there's some online resources. Certainly, Kids Grief, Canadian Virtual Hospice, the Children's and Youth Grief Network, and Good Grief. There's also really good videos from, from YouTube, When Families Grieve, from Sesame Street, that you can search on YouTube. And so, there's also Winston's Wish that has, kids and teens, but specifically for teens, it is also a good place to start. So I think what we can do at this point is, we can ask we're done presenting the content for our presentation now. And we can certainly give some time for those of the participants that have just some questions that you can either ask us, or you can put in the chat box. We'd be happy to kind of spend some time going over those with you. Just know that it is recording, so anything that you talk about, just be careful that it's non-identifiable, because we're recording this section.
If you'll see in your chat box, I did put in a handout that just summarizes our workshop and has all the resources listed there as well. Just so that you have that. If you didn't get it, just privately message me here on the on our chat, and then I'll make sure I send it to you. Thanks.
And I think that I might say that, children are grieving, and they're grieving in classrooms. And the important thing that, as a social worker, we want to say is that we notice that. And as a school board, we're really trying to support them in that, where they are. So as Nicole has said, and Jeremy says, we meet with students who have lost family members who have died, and it's a part of what we do. And so it's just know that that's within our role to support family members and certainly the students.
So I'm just going to try to resend it. Just give me 1 second for those of you who didn't get it.
I did see it in the chat box, Jeremy. So I think if people go to their chat box and then press download, it will download. I don't know, will it download on a phone? It will download on a computer for sure.
I sent it through Word as well on the chat box. So if you're still not, okay, let me try one more thing. What should we try here? Okay. Okay. It should just be a file, but I'm going to post a link here that you can use. Okay. And you can try that if you're not able to pick up the file somehow. I'm not sure why it's not open. So hopefully if you click on that link, that'll help.
Yeah. I do see all 3 things in the chat box. So the PDF, the Word, and then.
So one of those 3 should work,
link.
I think.
Yeah.
Yep. Great. Glad you got it. Okay. Well, it doesn't seem like there's too many questions, so we can always end off early. That's never a problem. Thank you all for joining us. I know these are hard topics to talk about, but I hope this has been helpful for you. And always, if there's any further questions in the future, or you're going through something, your schools are there to support you. There are school social workers in every school, as well as a bunch of other professional support services as well. We'll stick on this for a few more minutes if anyone has any other questions, but please feel free to have a good rest of your day. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.